I know you're busy. You have a million things obviously going on, so let me get right to the bottom line on some of them. What about a new stimulus bill? It's being talked about today. There are reports that the president would like to do a stimulus bill. Unclear whether it's something that other Republicans want to do on Capitol Hill. What is your view on the likelihood of another bill, and what is the timing for that?
Well, David, it's something we're very seriously considering. The president has been clear that we put a lot of money into the economy. We had an unprecedented response on a bipartisan basis in the last CARES bill, and there's no question that money is having a major impact on the economy, whether it's the PPP, which impacted 50 million workers, or whether it's the direct payments of over 160 million or enhanced unemployment. These are all having an important part of protecting American workers and American business. I actually just left the Republican Senate lunch, and we are beginning to discuss the different aspects of what another bill would look like. We want to take our time because, number one, there's a lot of money we still haven't put out. And number two, we want to make sure whatever we do going forward is much more targeted to the businesses that are most impacted.
But the timing, you think that it's likely that sometime in July a bill might pass both houses?
I do. That would be the timing.
Okay, and the negotiations, there are some people who think that you are not tough enough on the Democrats, and therefore some Republicans are saying that you should have a partner, Mark Meadows or somebody else, to negotiate. But in your view, you'll be the principal person negotiating with the Congress on this legislation. Is that right?
Well, David, I mean, let me first be clear. What I'm doing at the direction of the president, and it's the president's policies. Last time, Mark had just come on board, and I asked Mark to come up with me. He was very critical in helping with the last bill, so we have a great teamwork, and he will be there with me. But let me just say, I'm very proud of the fact that the last two bills were 96-0 and 100-0. So this isn't a question of being tough enough or not being tough enough. We had unprecedented bipartisan support at a time when it was critical to get money into the economy and to help American workers.
The parts that are the various bills that have passed so far, which do you think has been the most effective so far? The PPP, the unemployment insurance, the other loan programs, which are you think is working the best so far?
Well, David, as you know, because you've lived through other financial times, this is a very, very different situation than we've ever seen before. This is the first time that we've shut down the entire U.S. economy because of a virus, and we had to have a different approach. And the reason I mean a different approach was it was very important to get money into the economy quickly. Things that took 4 or 5 or 6 months, even if they in the long term worked better, would not have been effective. So we needed to have a range of tools. And if you look at the CARES Act, there were different tools that we used to put massive amounts of money into the economy. Obviously, as I just mentioned before, you had the PPP, you had the direct payments, you had the unemployment. We also had a program for the airlines, which was very critical. We had $450 billion that we could work with the Federal Reserve on the 13.3 facilities, and this really worked perfect. The mere announcement of some of these facilities unlocked the markets. Even without spending a penny of taxpayer dollars, it unlocked to the point where, you know, we've had unprecedented corporate issuance. Companies like Boeing, which I thought were going to need to come to us in our national security program, borrowed $25 billion in the market without putting a penny of taxpayer money at risk.
So right now, would you say that the legislation that you've passed is working reasonably well? But would you say the Fed has done as good a job as you would like them to do? They have a lending program, which I think has not yet actually lent money. And can you say whether the president is happy today or happier today with the head of the Federal Reserve?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve has done a phenomenal job. We speak to them almost on a daily basis. These programs are a combination of work of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and I think we've worked very well together. Every single one of these programs is now up and running. So we have a municipal bond program, we have a money market program, we have a commercial paper program, We have a Main Street program that's now up and running. We have a corporate primary and secondary. We had a program that lent to banks and non-banks for PPP loans. So the Fed acted in unprecedented response. And yes, I think you've seen the president is very pleased with what the Fed has been doing.
Okay. In terms of these programs, they do cost money. So the debt of the United States has increased a fair bit. I think maybe $4 trillion or something like that. Are you worried about the impact of that either on the dollar or on inflation?
Well, David, this is like a war. Fighting this virus is like fighting a war. And the president and I were determined to spend what we needed to spend to protect the American workers and the American public. This was not their fault. So no different than going into a war. You don't say, I'm going to stop here and deal with the consequences. I think over the long term, the good news is long-term interest rates are very low. So the cost of this debt is very low. We're borrowing a lot of money long-term. We have a lot of liquidity. The dollar is the reserve currency of the world, so we have a lot of liquidity in borrowing. And yes, over time, we're going to need to deal with the debt. I think you have to look at both the debt as a percentage of GDP and a percentage of what it costs to carry it. So these are things we'll look at over time.
In terms of the loans that are being made now, at one point you had said it was important not to reveal who the borrowers were. Recently, you've said you think it's okay to disclose. Why did you change your mind, or why did the government change its position?
Well, David, let me clarify. When we negotiated these deals on a bipartisan basis, we agreed to an unprecedented level of transparency and oversight. And we didn't need to do this, but we agreed within the Federal Reserve programs and within the programs coming from the Treasury, the direct loans, there would be complete transparency. And that was very clear. We never really discussed the specifics of the PPP. Now, it is true when the SBA makes 7A loans, they are transparent. The issue here was you had businesses that took loans based upon their payroll. And no different, we're not publicizing everybody's name who is getting enhanced unemployment. We wanted to make sure we protected small businesses, the confidentiality of their payroll. So I think we've struck the appropriate balance on protection and transparency. And what we just agreed on a bipartisan basis with the SBA committee is that we would release the names on about 75% of the dollars and about 25% of the actual loans. So that's all loans above $150,000, and we'll put them in buckets. So you don't know the exact size, but we'll bucket them. There'll be, 150 to 350. I think it's $1 million to $2 million, $5 million to $10 million, various different buckets. And on the very small loans, $150,000 and below, we'll release the details of the names, but not the borrowers. So I think we got to an important compromise of transparency on the majority of the money with the idea of protecting very small businesses, sole proprietors, and others' confidentiality.
Okay. In this quarter, we have slipped into a recession, and according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, which makes the official determinations of when you're in a recession or not. Do you think by the end of this year we might be out of the recession?
David, I do, but the traditional economic metrics aren't really appropriate given we shut down the economy. So first, let me say there were way too many people that lost their jobs and got laid off. And again, we're not going to be done until we get every single one of those people back to work. So I'm not really focused on the technical issue of it is a recession or it's not a recession. I'm focused on helping all these small businesses and all the workers. And that's what our job. And I think you saw the recent employment numbers. People thought there'd be another 8 million people unemployed. We put 2.5 million people back to work. Clearly, this is the PPP working. And you saw great retail sales. I think you're going to see the economy had a very bad second quarter. I think you're going to see a spectacular rebound off the bottom in the third quarter.
And some people who have been gotten the PPP loans are very happy with them, but they say it's unclear whether they have to repay them or not. Will the SBA clarify who actually has to repay or not repay those loans?
Well, the good news is, again, I think we struck the right balance here. And for all loans that are less than $2 million, we created a safe harbor around the certification unless there's things like fraud. And for loans over $2 million, they're going to go through an electronic review to make sure that the companies needed the money in the certification. And I think that'll be a very fair process as we go through that.
If you owe taxes on April the 15th, you could file on July the 15th. Is there any consideration, as some people have speculated, that it might be postponed once again to maybe September 15th?
Well, David, it's something I'm thinking about. As of now, we're not intending on doing that, but it is something we may consider. I am pleased to report that I think it was absolutely the right thing to do at the time, because we were absolutely worried about people couldn't get to their accountants, couldn't get their information. And I'm pleased to report that returns filed are down only 10% year over year, and refunds are down only 10%. So the majority of Americans have filed. The majority of those people that needed to get refunds got them. I'd encourage all Americans, if you can file your tax returns, go ahead and do it, particularly if you think you have a refund. And we'll look carefully as we approach this July date.
Okay. Now, you've talked about shutting down the economy, which obviously we had to do and was done. But you've also said recently that we can't do it again because we just can't afford to do it. So are you worried that new COVID cases are breaking out in states like Florida or Texas? And how will you deal with that in terms of opening up the economy again, but also protecting the safety of people?
Well, David, I think the president made the absolute right decision. It was a very difficult decision in shutting down the entire economy. The issues that we were concerned about at the time were hospitals were getting way overcrowded. We had issues of ventilators, and we had issues of not having enough medicines. I think, we had an unprecedented effort, especially in places like New York, where we built out extra hospital beds in the convention center. We sent the Navy ship there to be ready as a hospital. And the good news is those never needed to be used. Right now, we're in a different situation. Right now, we have plenty of capacity. We got plenty of ventilators. We've made great progress on viral treatments. And we've made great progress on testing. So I think this is going to be an issue that we have to look at on a local by local basis. Where there are breakouts, there'll be contact tracing. And I think we're just in a completely different situation. So I think it would be highly unlikely we get to a point where we need to shut the economy down again.
Okay. You were one of the principal negotiators with Bob Lighthizer of the deal with China. Are you confident that the Chinese can honor the commitments to buy the products from the United States that they agreed to?
I have every expectation that they will. They have continued to tell us that they will, as recently as last week when Secretary Pompeo met with one of the senior people that flew in from China, and they had a summit. So I have that expectation that they will lead up to their obligation. Now, having said that, let me just comment on, I think the world wants a lot more transparency on COVID. How did it start? How did it spread? How did it spread around the world? And it didn't spread within China. So we shouldn't confuse these two issues. Yes, we have expectations that they will live up to their trade agreements, but we also have expectations they need a lot more transparency around the disease.
There is not more transparency. Do you think there will be a decoupling with the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy? I think you have talked about that recently, but you see that as being separate than the trade agreement. But are you worried about it, or do you think it could be appropriate to have a decoupling at some point?
Well, I don't want to speculate, David. It could. I think you have a lot of companies that are beginning to look at their supply chains and making sure they diversify them. And I think that's something that's prudent to do wherever they are around the world. You have a lot of companies that are looking at bringing jobs back to the U.S. because of our tax incentives in other areas. As we have said all along, if we can compete with China on a fair and level playing field, it is a great opportunity for U.S. businesses and U.S. workers as China has a large growing middle class, several hundred million people. But if we can't participate and compete on a fair basis, then you are going to see a decoupling going forward.
So the Chinese government is thinking about changing the ways in which it operates and oversees Hong Kong. The president has been concerned about that, so has Secretary Pompeo. If the Chinese government were to go forward with legislation it's considering, do you think the U.S. government might impose some type of sanctions to show its disapproval of what's going on?
Well, David, it's our policy. We don't comment on future sanctions, but what I will comment on is the president, and this was a few weeks ago at his Rose Garden speech, instructed me to convene what's called the President's Working Group on Capital Markets. This is myself and all the major regulators, and we're looking at all of these issues very carefully as it relates to both Hong Kong and as it relates to Chinese issuance on the U.S. exchanges.
Okay. Now, recently there was a report that we're running out of, not running out of, but we're having a little less demand for, less supply, I should say, of coins. We have a lot of dollar bills, I guess, in circulation, but because of COVID, we don't have as many coins. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, David, let me first say I want to thank the hardworking men and women at the Bureau of Engraving and at the Mint. And that's where we make both the money and where we make the coins. And through this entire period, they didn't shut down production. And matter of fact, as it relates to circulating money in bills, we had unprecedented deliveries to the Federal Reserve, which they were able to put into the various banks. As it relates to coins, because so many businesses shut down, a lot of coins got stuck in the system. So we got a little bit far behind on coins, but I know they're redoubling their efforts, and that'll work out fine.
Well, I have a lot of pennies and quarters at my house. Maybe I can drop them off somewhere and help in some modest way. I'll let you know. So let me ask you.
Take as many as you have, David. I know you got plenty of them.
Okay. So being Secretary of the Treasury in a normal time is not easy, very busy, one of the most important jobs in Washington or in the country. But during this time, you've been, working around the clock. Have you had any time to just breathe, any time to see your family? How are you? Are you working out of your office? Are you working out of your home? How are you getting through this period of time?
I'm working out of the Treasury, so basically every day I go from my home to the Treasury to the White House, which is right next door and back. We've had about 150 people working around the clock in the Treasury, and the rest of the people working telecommuting. I think, like a lot of businesses, we were actually pleasantly surprised that a lot of areas we could effectively work by telework. There were other areas like the IRS where it was much harder to do certain things. You can't open the mail. We had truckloads of mail back up and physical returns and audits. But I want to thank, we had an enormous group of people here that have been working around the clock, and I'll have plenty of time to rest down the road. My family understands that.
Exercise? There's any time to just relax a little bit or walk or exercise, or you have no time for that now?
Trying to do a little bit of exercise. Never enough, but trying to do a little bit.
So as you go forward, you obviously enjoy the job, and you obviously are well respected by many of your colleagues. So if President Trump is reelected, would you be interested in serving another 4 years in this position?
Yes, David, as I said before, I would be, but that's for the president to decide.
Okay. And going forward, what kind of advice would you give to anybody else who serves as Secretary of Treasury at some point? What is the best thing to do, and what's the thing you should avoid doing as Secretary of Treasury?
Well, the interesting part about Secretary of Treasury is it spans across so many different parts of the government. So a large part of the job is domestic and international finance. A very big part of the job is just operational. We manage a lot of the payment processing, obviously all the borrowings for the government. And something that I've spent a lot of my time on, and I think I've talked about this before, prior to COVID, I was probably spending 50% of my time on national security issues, because sanctions have been such an important part of our national security strategy. And despite John Bolton's comments in the books complaining that I didn't do enough sanctions, it's really somewhat ridiculous, since under President Trump, we've done more sanctions than any previous administrations combined. But we've had a very unified approach, myself, Secretary Pompeo, DOD, and the CIA, as to how we approach the national security issues.
Hey, the stock market is roughly where it was before we went into the recession. Why do you think the stock market seems to be so ebullient, relatively strong, when the economy is not as strong as the stock market? Or has that been a surprise to you as somebody who's used to spend a lot of time in the markets?
Well, David, having spent a lot of time in the markets, as I always like to say, I'm not good at predicting where they are going to be tomorrow or next week. I am good at predicting where they're going to be in the future. I think what you've seen, and first let me just say, the stock market is a market of stocks. So certain stocks have done phenomenally well. You look at companies like Apple that are great companies. And again, COVID's not going to have a giant impact on their business. And they're a technology leader. You look at some of the retailers, and they've had a pretty difficult situation. If you haven't been a major retailer, you had your stores closed, you're already dealing with online issues. And the fact that interest rates came down obviously also changes valuations. But I think the bigger issue is the U.S. is still the bright spot of the economic growth around the world. People have confidence that our economy is going to come back in the third and fourth quarter, and people want to invest in the U.S.
So as part of a new bill, if a bill does go through Congress, would infrastructure be part of it? The president has talked about having an infrastructure bill. Would that be a separate, or would that possibly be part of a stimulus bill or a relief bill?
I think, as you know, the president's been very interested in infrastructure since the campaign. It's something we've been talking about on a bipartisan basis. The president's interested in roads and bridges and tunnels, and we continue to have those conversations. The issue with infrastructure is normally these are not shovel ready. So normally these, even if we pass something, this isn't going to impact getting people back to work in September and October. So I think that the likelihood is the next CARES bill is going to be very focused on, we want to make sure that 20 million people that don't have jobs because of COVID get back to work. And that's going to be our focus, and for them to get back to work quickly.
How do you keep up with your colleagues around the world who are the finance ministers of major countries that we have relationships with? Do you regularly consult with them, or do you do it one-on-one? How do you do that right now during this crisis?
Well, I have very good relationships with a lot of my counterparts, so I do speak to them on a regular basis. Also this year, the United States is chairing the G7 presidency. So I convene pretty much every other week a call of the G7 finance ministers or deputies. We tend to rotate. So we're in direct communication. And one of the things I've said to all of them is now it's even more important than ever that we are working together as we all battle this disease and focus on rebuilding our economies.
So do you worry about the impact of COVID on the emerging markets, which have a different currency, which is relatively weaker against the dollar recent months or so? Are you worried about the economies in those countries being able to repay debt that they may owe to people in the United States?
Well, I am worried about that. We're doing a lot of work at the IMF and the World Bank on those economies. We've created a debt moratorium for the particularly poor countries because what they're going through. And that's something we are definitely focused on is working with the poorest countries. We're also very focused on what we call debt transparency, making sure that it's transparent when countries borrow, whether it's from China or Europe or anywhere in the world, that there's transparency into the situation.
Now, in the last recession, 10 years ago or so, the banks were in pretty big trouble, and they had to be, in effect, given additional capital by the United States at some points. Right now, you think the banks are in very good shape and our financial institutions are safe and strong despite the COVID crisis?
I do, David. Unlike last time, as you said, the bank capital rules have changed. The mix of their books have changed. You don't have these problem mortgages that you had last time. Underwriting's gotten much better. So the banks had very good capital and very good liquidity coming into this. And I think what we've seen is in the beginning of COVID, there was a big run to draw revolvers. And I think we've seen a lot less of that. And my understanding of speaking to the major bank CEOs, The typical mid-market companies, again, if they're not in retail and entertainment and restaurants, if they're not in the areas that are particularly hard hit, have a reasonable amount of liquidity and borrowing power.
So the first Treasury Secretary was Alexander Hamilton, and you probably have seen the play Hamilton. So do you ever get any whispers at night from the ghost of Hamilton saying you're doing a good job or do this or do that, or you just imagine what he might be recommending that you do?
All the time, David. I got a big portrait of him. He stares at me at my desk, and occasionally he gives me some good advice.
Okay. Steve, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your giving us your insights, and good luck on all the things you're working on.
Thank you, David.